All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. So I get the task of kicking this off, and then we'll hand it off to Dr. Ickes to really get into the details of how we pulled this off. But what I want to do is just introduce the concept, where this came from, how we decided to do what we're doing. Um, so the idea here is that scientific communication needs to be audience appropriate. All right, and so. Um, we basically, when we think about science, there are those of us on campus here in the lab, and you're talking to those around you, and these are conversations that don't necessarily work well with the general public. So if you would go ahead, a couple of clicks here. So I wanted to kind of break down the three main styles of scientific communication, and then get to how we arrived at a comic book out of all of this. And so there's that peer-to-peer conversation. These are collaborators. They're people that work within your area, within your field. These tend to be very jargon-laden, very acronym-laden conversations. The general population is at a loss for what is being conveyed out of these. Then we can take a step back and we can have conversations to the scientific community. So this would be a broad scientific audience at a conference or research days, things like that, where there's an expectation that there is a background in science. But you tend to back the conversation off a little bit and do a better job of describing the foundation of your work. Then we have what is the most difficult part of scientific communication, and that is conveying our craft to non-scientists. Okay, and so this is talking to the general population. And if COVID has taught us anything, scientific messaging is absolutely critical and to make sure that people understand what's going on here. So in the last couple of years, the idea of using alternative means by which to communicate science has started to gain a little bit of traction. NCATS has gotten on board with this and presented some webinars on a few groups out of the University of California that have taken some environmental science papers and basically illustrated them to an extent. And they presented some of the work on how they did this and showed some of the comic that was developed. And I thought, we have a lot of really good work happening on this campus. Is this something that we could do here? Is this a way to try and challenge our investigators and provide a tool for the general population? All right, and so some of the basis for this comes from the use of comics very effectively just in day-to-day life. Obviously, safety information is typically cartoonish. If you walk into any lab, if you see that skull and crossbones icon on a chemical jar or container, you immediately know that there's something bad going on within that substance has the ability to do something bad. One of the kind of the hallmark studies to come out that really demonstrated the value in science and then potentially in clinical medicine of the use of cartoon was a cardiology study where they actually compared two consent documents, one essentially fully illustrated, and then one was the standard 19-20 page consent document that was basically just a narrative of what the process would look like, the study would look like, what you were going to do. At the end of the day, they did pre and post surveying of the participants. They identified that the individuals that saw the cartoon, the consent that looked like a comic, had less pre-procedure apprehension. They had a better understanding of what was going to happen during the procedure, and also demonstrated a better understanding of what the follow-up period would look like after the procedure than those that had gone through a standard consenting process. And so, that's kind of a huge step forward for the utility here of a picture as opposed to words, if you will. So go ahead, next slide here. So how did we bring this to life at the University of Kentucky? So after kind of seeing some of these webinars and thinking, we probably have something that we can work with here. The first thing we had to do was establish a team. I have a PhD in nutritional sciences. I have undergraduate degrees in science. Nowhere along the way did anybody ever teach me how to illustrate a comic book. And so the first question was, what on earth do we do? How do we get started? And so CCTS is a very talented group of participant recruitment specialists. All of the banners, all of the signs, all of the flyers you see around campus, they develop. All right. And so I knew we had some artistic talent in our ranks. I walked across the hall and I said, okay, guys, what does it cost to get a cartoon or a comic book illustrator, and how does the process work? And I actually kind of got laughed at when I said that, because there was something I didn't know. And that is, amongst our ranks, Bryan Sanders had already, I believe at that point, published 3 comic books. He had 3 commercially available comic books. I'm sitting there asking him if he has any idea how you produce a comic book. All right. And so the single biggest barrier that I saw moving forward with this process was basically eliminated right there. And that was such a relief. So we kind of got our bits together here. We said, okay, I believe we have the resources to do this. We got everybody on board. We produced an RFA. And so unlike traditional RFAs that CCTS puts out, where we ask you to present us with a proposal, include your methodology, include a justification, include future directions, what is the science going to be, and how are we going to do it? This RFA asked investigators to take a paper that had been published in the last 3 years and basically turn it into a storyboard. So we're digging into the creativity of the investigators here to take whatever they had in their manuscript and bring it to life. All right. And that's a very big challenge for people that are just science. We had some really great submissions. I'll be honest, we got the review committee together. We sat around a table and it was tough. I mean, we had some very creative investigators that took their molecules of interest and brought them to life. And it really was an interesting exercise to see this happen. So we released the RFA in the summer. We awarded in October 2019. Dr. Ickes was on the receiving end of that award. And we said, okay, now we're going to produce a comic book. And so this is the part where I'm going to step aside and let Dr. Ickes walk you through her view of how this process works. But before I do that, I want to emphasize a couple of things here. This is where I really get out of the way of this process. All right. The things that you need to do this successfully is an amazing illustrator. Okay. And so as we go through this process and you see the pictures and you see the transitions from sketch to full color page, understand that Bryan Sanders literally took words on a page and turned them into pictures. Okay. And that is a process I can't imagine doing. So you need that level of skill. Also appreciate that by the time we went to press, we were probably on revision 40 or 50 of the transcript and the images and everything else. And again, this is where Ashley Hall came in. She organized and wrangled this entire process from start to finish to make sure that through all of these iterations, we had the right copies going where they needed to go. We had the right pictures going where they needed to go, and really managed that in an incredible way. And then at the end of the day, we brought our communication director, Mallory Profeta, in to make sure that the commas and the semicolons and the language and the phraseology was actually appropriate and publishable. Okay. And so that team really pulled this off. And then as you'll see, as Dr. Ickes talks here, she probably didn't realize how much time she was going to invest in this when she signed up for it. And so that's another remarkable piece of this, is the amount of effort that she was willing and able to put forward to make this work. So with that, I'm going to get out of the way and I'm going to let the people that really put this into action describe the process and what they did to make this a reality.
Thanks so much, Joel. That's a great intro. And you really did help make this a reality. All of your insight and sitting around the table, having those initial conversations helped everything come to fruition. So, hi, everyone. I'm so excited to share a little more about our experience and the steps we went through to take a research study to a comic book. Who would have thought? When I first embarked on this journey, I honestly had no idea what to expect. I certainly knew nothing about comic books, nor do I consider myself artistic at all. To be quite honest, when I was notified that I was the winner selected, I panicked and I thought, what in the world did I get myself into? How am I going to, take statistics and turn it into a comic book? Looking back more than a year later, I'm so proud of what we accomplished together. And I still have to pinch myself to say that we created this amazing and professional comic book, which is right here. When I got my first copy, I really was jumping up and down and just so enthralled. And like Joel said, this was a process. This also took a team effort. And I think we all learned a lot throughout this process. So a comic book doesn't just happen. You don't just say, hey, let's throw this story together and out we have this 10-page comic book. So today I'd like to share a little bit about the process that we went through, some things that I learned throughout the process. And then hopefully we'll have some time for Ashley and Bryan to share their lessons learned, because they were an integral part of this process. None of it could have happened without all of us collaboratively working together. And so you need a team to support you. You need a team to help bring your ideas to life. And like Joel said, be prepared for revisions. It made me laugh especially when we got towards the end and we were doing just, the small grammar edits, and all of us are kind of like, let's just be done with this. But we are very proud of our final product. So this just kind of shows some of the steps we went through. I feel like we should have done a video of this experience while we were doing it, because we had some really fun conversations around the table, especially with some of those initial brainstorming sessions. But just to back up a little bit, when the call came out and asked about sharing a current publication or research study and then pitching an idea for a comic, I immediately thought of some of my work with tobacco prevention, specifically understanding youth and young adult e-cigarette use. We had just published a study which looked at Juul, which is one type of or one brand of e-cigarette use on our campus back in spring of 2018, which now seems like a lifetime ago. And just, this is the screenshot of the published study. This is what we typically see, right? As academics, we share our abstract, we share a highlight of our statistics and what those main findings were of our study. So a few study highlights just from this particular publication. At the time, over a third of our convenience sample of college students reported ever using Juul, which again is just one brand of e-cigarette that had kind of ramped up the market at the time. And then 21% had reported current or past 30-day use. So when I first saw these statistics come out when we were working on this study, I was honestly taken aback, because these rates were higher than any other substances we had seen in, a really, really long time. And so equally concerning because of the nicotine concentration in these products. We also found that significant risk factors for Juul use were males, white non-Hispanics, lower undergraduates. And so I think that's a really important point, because while it was a small convenience sample, the results were shocking, and it inspired a follow-up study among incoming freshmen the next year, because we learned that, youth are using these while they are still in high school. So this is just a little bit about that follow-up research study. Here you can see that among our incoming freshmen, so those transitioning from high school, that 41% had reported ever use, and then almost 1 in 4 reported current use. And again, we're talking about one particular brand of e-cigarette. And so unfortunately, not only were we seeing an increase in use among young people, but we were also seeing more frequent use, as seen here. So you can see that, they were using 10 to 29 days or all 30 days of the past month. So we were certainly seeing a risk for dependence and then potentially other use of other substances. So it was almost this serendipitous moment, because when I saw the CCTS call come out, I knew that we had to do something to target this issue. And while I love researching this topic, what I really like is to think of innovative ways to do something about an issue. And it was clear that prevention and intervention efforts were needed. And at that time, nothing had really been done. There was no education, no prevention efforts. Now, a few years later, we've come a long way. But I felt like, okay, so this comic book, is this something that we could potentially use to talk with young people about this issue and to, have community conversations, school conversations? And, it was just one of those things in the back of my mind that as we went through this creative development process, that I always wanted to use this as an intervention, as a conversation piece in the community. So, really, as Joel mentioned, I think if I were to go into a classroom and say, here are the statistics of young people using e-cigarettes, in your age group, most young people are going to tune out. They're not really going to think that that's relevant to them and or that they're at risk. And so I loved the idea of thinking about how to tell the story through a visual depiction to not only reinforce the severity of this problem and that they are susceptible, but also to think about who do we really need to target with prevention, but also treatment efforts. And so, the team was amazing in helping me pull this together and make this vision a reality. So the official process began with convening our team, as Joel mentioned, and CCTS provided wonderful support and built the necessary infrastructure to make this comic a possibility. None of this would have been possible without this team effort and all of our brainstorm sessions, individual ideas and reflection, and patience. I think we all learned a lot about being patient throughout the process. And we'll hopefully hear from Ashley in a little bit, just in terms of her general lessons learned. But, you know, she really keeps things moving along. We had timelines. We had, you know, lots of moving parts in terms of the pages coming together, the text coming together. And so trying to get feedback from numerous people, you know, but also moving forward, because at the time we had a deadline, right? We wanted to present this last year at the spring research conference and then debut the comic at the at Comic-Con. And unfortunately, due to COVID, things were kind of put on hold. But at the time we had this timeline. And so we knew we had to get to print by a certain date. And so we had to keep moving forward. And Ashley certainly helped us all keep moving forward, and so appreciative of that. So we wrapped up the comic early last spring, and we were able to print previews and final copies. And we have about 2,500 comics printed thanks to our sponsors. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about next steps and what we're going to do with those printed comics and how that's transitioned a bit. So having somebody to help lead the charge is necessary. That's something that I, you know, looking back on it, I wouldn't have expected that we needed to have one person to kind of rein us in. And you know, I think we can all go off on different tangents with creative ideas or saying this is what we need to include, but we have to eventually all come to a consensus and then, you know, get that final product out there. So this is just kind of a picture of some of the sketches. This is one of our brainstorming session. We would sit around the table and we would talk about, okay, is this what you like? Is this what you're thinking? Does this make sense? Does this all fit on the page? And that was certainly something that I learned. You know, you have this idea of, okay, I would like there to be 5 stories in this comic. And then you quickly realize to tell, you know, just a part of one story of one scene, you have to use a couple of pages and panels. And so all of this was new lingo to me. And thanks to Bryan for being so patient and describing and explaining everything. But this is kind of what we did to get everything kicked off. And then, of course, yes, having the creative capacity and someone willing to listen to your ideas, as crazy as they might seem, and bring them to life. So none of this would be possible without Bryan. And Bryan, we thank you so, so much. You know, I cannot say enough positive things about working with Bryan. We sure had some laughs during our sessions, and I learned more about comic books than I ever thought possible. Bryan is truly a creative genius, and he made this into an exciting story well beyond a research study. And our final product is even better than I could have imagined because of his willingness to listen. And then sometimes he tried to push us, you know, okay, let's push the envelope a little bit. Sometimes we had to reel Bryan in and say, okay, we can't have an explosion in every single scene, but we'll add a few of those in because we know that that's what sells comic books. And I'll show you some of the examples of what that process looked like. Before we get to that, I just wanted to share a little bit about envisioning the characters. And so when you submitted your LOI for this, you were supposed to kind of pitch character ideas. And so at the time, I knew that I wanted to have 2 main young adult characters, one who became dependent on e-cigarettes and one who faced similar pressures, but ended up not using. And so how do you do that? How do you just take an idea, a name, a brief description of a character and turn it into a true, you know, person on the page? And so basically I would share some images that I Googled or found and with Bryan and say, okay, this is kind of what I'm thinking. And we would talk back and forth a lot about it. And these were just some initial images. I looked back in my saved folders and said comic characters, character development. And so basically then Bryan would just draw something and we would all look at it and we would say, okay, this looks good. Let's tweak this a little bit. But these are our characters that emerge. And I love our characters. I think they really have their own personality. So Depp is the young man and Kat is the young woman that are the main characters of our story. And their friendship is a cornerstone of the story. I think that, it's important because we really wanted these characters to be relatable. And now I can't imagine them looking in another way. It's like they're ingrained in my head as Kat and Depp. The other main character is Cool Ghoul that you can see there. And Cool Ghoul represents the e-cigarette industry and our products. And we wanted him to look sleek, a little fun, but also a little sly, kind of manipulative, because that's, those are really all the things that the industry also portrays. And so, Bryan came up with the best Cool Ghoul. I think that hands down, it's the best, most favorite character. We want to hate him, but we love him. And you can see some of the other guest appearances by characters, including my dog Lucy. Thanks, Bryan. we also have a combination of a medical expert, a support person, or a professor, and then family members who are all critical to this issue. So from vision to reality, I've talked a lot about, the stages, or there are a lot of steps involved. And so we took kind of this vision of plot ideas that I initially had. We created a script. And I remember when Ashley said, okay, I want you to write out a 10-page script. And I thought, what in the world? Where do you even start with that? But we broke it down into smaller segments. And these were just the original vision for scenes that I had. And we kind of looked at those and we said, do these fit? Can we make all of these work? What's most important? What do we need to pull out? And so from there, we quickly realized we had to narrow it down because, like I said before, telling the story takes up way more space than you think just to get your points across, get the narrative across. We also wanted the story to have a common theme and common themes throughout. It needed to have a hook. People needed to look at the first couple of pages and say, all right, I want to continue reading this. And then there had to be a pivotal moment. And that was something that Bryan really helped us work on. And then, of course, we wanted there to be some sort of resolution at the end. That's a lot to fit into 10 pages. And so lots of shifting, lots of puzzle pieces, but I feel like we were able to truly tell the story that we wanted to tell. So from those scenes, Bryan created rough sketches. You can see some examples here. Then we would meet, we would review all of these. We would talk about, okay, does this panel fit? Does it make sense to shift something out of here? Do we want to move forward with kind of the next stage of sketches? So then you can see from rough sketches to a more pencil version, how things transformed. And so while we have some similarities, we also had some things that we changed throughout, or we said, okay, we know that we want to say this on this page. So how do we make sure that the pictures are also helping to support that story? And so you can already see the story starting to come to life. And then, of course, we transition to pencil, or we went after penciling the scenes, then we started coloring, then you start determining the narrative. So once we had the color done, y'all, I thought, okay, we're good. This is it. We've made it. We've made it uphill. And then we started talking about having to figure out what text we wanted in speech bubbles. And I think, to be honest, that is something that took the most time, because you have to be really thoughtful in terms of not putting too much text on the screen, but also, are they saying things that are relatable? Are they saying things that support the research study? Because in the back of your mind, you always have this research study that you're trying to showcase. So here you'll see just the colored pages, and then the next session, or this next image, you'll see where we started adding text bubbles. And then that's where we also had to start doing lots and lots of grammar edits and back and forth. And so one of the things that we decided is to kind of highlight some of the research points before we were trying to put everything into the speech bubbles. And we found that it was too busy. It was distracting from the wonderful artwork that we had, and we didn't want that. And so I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by pulling out some of those research highlights in a second. But, I think that it was an interesting process just because, like Joel said, it took way more time, I think, than any of us anticipated, but it's worth it. If you really want to have a quality product, you need to invest the time at the beginning in those planning stages. So just a few considerations throughout the process. Are the characters relatable? So obviously we're trying to touch youth and young adults. Do the scenes depict real life for youth and young people? We had conversations like, are they at a party? Are they studying in the library? Are they going for coffee? Things that youth and young people tend to do. How do you balance research, creativity, and telling a story? And it's challenging. I think that's why you have to have multiple people on your team to bounce ideas off and say, okay, we need to pull back this a little bit and make sure that we're still sticking to the story. How do we keep the flow going from page to page? And that was something I hadn't considered. So, when we're talking about e-cigarette dependence, it doesn't happen overnight. And so we wanted this to be over time and to be able to show some of the health effects when Depp started using e-cigarettes, and then also give him the opportunity to stop using. And so how do you, transition from 3 months later? And so Bryan was really helpful in supporting the story as we changed pages, then we kind of progressed a couple of months forward. And then how do you find a balance depicting the consequences of these products while not allowing that to be the only focus? And I think that our story has balance where we really are able to talk about the health effects. We're able to showcase some of the consequences, but then also, what are other factors that are important to youth and young people? Because that's not everything that they want to talk about. And I think that's where us making it relatable and relevant came into play. So thinking about things like social influences, manipulation and targeting strategies, the health effects that are happening now, short term, also thinking about secondhand aerosol exposure and how use impacts others, not just the user, environmental influences. That was something that I really wanted to add in there at the end because I went to a conference and I thought, oh my gosh, we have to talk about the environment. And of course, Bryan made it happen. And then the other really interesting thing I think about this topic and this research study is that this is a changing landscape almost daily, weekly. At the time, it was also when EVALI came out and, so we were seeing e-cigarettes in the news every single day. And so we had to have conversations. Is what we're putting into the comics still relevant? Are there going to be policy changes? Thinking about leaving things a little open so that we also had room for growth as those landscapes changed. And then just lastly, I think, working with young people and concurrently developing an e-cig prevention program, it was on my mind. We have to engage the young people because we need to know, are we using the correct terminology? Does this even make sense to them? And so I had a group of some of my college students that I work with who are I Can End the Trend ambassadors. And they reviewed it for language. They also asked some of our partner high school students. We had one middle school student to review it. And they did give us some really great suggestions where they would say things like, we don't talk like that, or we don't say things. And so we changed the speech bubbles, to make sure that it was reflective of language that youth and young people would actually use, not just academics and researchers. And I think that was really a helpful part of the process. So I mentioned that we included research highlights throughout, and this is just an example. So we wanted to make sure that we were true to the research studies done and that we were trying to reinforce through the story the research facts. But we also figured out that, young people want to know the research. They want to know the science behind why you're telling them something. And so we decided to include, not on every page, not on every panel, but a few key highlights from the research. And so here you can see the actual statistics that were from the study, and then we just had a really small call out on the page. And if you look at that scene, the scene here, it's really about flavors, and that fruit flavors were really popular. And so you can see the little bubbles that have different fruit flavors that are depicted. The colors also depict the fruit flavors, but we really wanted to pull that out in terms of this is supported by research. And then here's another example. I love this one because, they're off campus, but they're still being influenced. And so among college freshmen who reported any e-cig use, 50% actually purchased at gas station or convenience stores, and 23% got from a friend, 22% bought at a vape store. So we wanted to show some of the advertising and the things that are in the surrounding environment for youth and young people. Okay, so I know I've thrown a lot at you all, but I would love to just take a moment to see if the team, if you all have anything else to add in terms of lessons learned on this process. And Ashley, I'm going to pitch it to you just to see if you have anything to add.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Ickes. And thanks everyone for joining us today. We've been really excited about this opportunity to share this work with you. So as the developmental editor, I learned a lot of lessons. I feel like we all did. But the first that I would like to share is just to have a game plan, but then have a plan B and also have a plan C. And like all of the circumstances that can occur, in particular, the COVID health pandemic, it certainly threw a wrench into our plans for, just printing, which we went with physical copies, and we do plan to distribute those when we can. And also, promotion and just virtual access and how we wanted to handle all of those, considering that, everyone was learning virtually at that time. And so the second lesson that I wanted to say is just ask for help. This was not only our team members that were named, but a lot of others, that helped along the way to read drafts or to give input or to say, hey, I heard this in the news today. Are you all talking about that with the comic? And I do want to say that, Bryan was amazing as our creative director in terms of getting all of the art, all of the various revisions, everything taken care of. But we did call in some additional reinforcements to get everything across the finish line. So we did have some guest artists who were able to help us as well. And so they helped us with the front cover and then also the lettering process. So we had to have all of those pieces in motion at the same time. And the final thing that I would say is just, be mindful of whatever is going on in your particular project. But as Mindy just mentioned, the current events and what's happening in the external, world with your topic. And so we really did try to incorporate those policy changes or laws or conversations that were happening, in the book and in the details. So those are the biggest lessons that I learned. Super proud of this product and happy to turn it over to our artist, Bryan Sanders.
Thanks, Ashley. Yep, and thanks everyone for tuning into this talk. And just to reiterate what everyone said, just was really an amazing, interesting process. And I've never done something quite like this before, as far as more educational, more some of the entertainment stuff that I've done in the past with movies and comics have been, explosions, action, adventure. But this was was an interesting challenge to take something that was like this and to break it down to something that would be more manageable across the different mediums. And just because it was a different subject and a different matter, I was still able to get one explosion in at the end. That was one of the things. Is like, you can't have an explosion on every page. And there's just like, well, just like that scene in Terminator, where he's like, the fire, and it was like, I had there was like a lot of the funny behind the scenes stuff. It's just like, come on, Bryan, just one explosion. We'll give you one explosion. But no, it was just really, really cool working with everything. And I just can't wait till we get to really show this off and to get more exposure for it, because I think it's really going to change some minds and change some hearts, because it really smoking and e-cigs are a very, very problem from where I come from. And I've mentioned this with my parents and a few other people, because I used to be a substitute teacher, and I talked with some people, and they said that this problem is really, really bad in high schools and stuff. And they're just like, where can we get this comic? When can we get the comic? And unfortunately, yeah, we were ready to rock and roll for the spring conference last year and Lexington Comic-Con, and then just a few days later, the country shut down. So we've just kind of been on the back burner, but we've still been working on stuff. We're still working on promotions, and we still have other events coming out. So when this comic book really rolls out, I think it really will change some hearts and minds.
Thank you so much. And Joel, did you have anything else to add?
No, I was just going to say it was really fun to hear all that and kind of go back and revisit the process, and all the steps and everything that went into pulling this off. And I think the pop culture dilemma that we ran into is, if you go back and Google Jewel from December of 2019 through spring of 2020, there was a period where we were almost done with a comic where it looked like Jewel may be banned by the government. And it literally looked like we may have all of this effort for a product that no longer is available on the market. And so, I mean, as we were talking about all of the changes and the day-to-day changes in legislation and, kind of Jewel in the news and whatnot, I mean, it got to the point where we weren't sure we were actually going to have anything useful at the end of this. We're working so hard at the table to get the illustrations, the words, and the data in there in an effective manner, and still listening, to see if there was even going to be Jewel the next day to worry about. And so, that was a very fun recall right there on this whole process.
Thank you all so much. And I think, unfortunately, we still have to worry about this issue. And when we were talking about some of the legislation with Jewel coming about, we found kind of at that same time that the disposable e-cigarettes were really becoming popular. And so we made sure to put some images that reflect, the new product landscape. And so I think we still have some things to talk about with youth and young people. So what's next? And yes, we had all of these grand plans for last spring. And that's my lesson. Be flexible and just go with the flow. Because, COVID certainly derailed some of those things, but we are still really eager and excited to get this comic out there. And I know that we're going to have a mini debut, I guess, the CCTS Spring Conference. Ashley, do you have any more details on that?
I do, and I actually am going to put in a link for registration for the conference to the chat for everyone. We will have an opportunity for you to win a copy of the comic, but I don't want to give too much away because, I want you to find that out when you come and join us. And I do also want to make you all aware that we are going to work in collaboration with our communications director, Mallory Profeta, and we are going to have a web page, a landing page, essentially on the CCTS website for the comic. And so this will kind of just house, general information, probably this presentation, as well as, a form that you could complete if you wanted a copy, or if you wanted to participate in some of the interventions or next steps that Dr. Ickes is going to talk about in the following slides. So while we did plan to, have our physical copies and everything there last year, we had to pivot. So we will give you a little preview, but we will also give you the opportunity to win a physical copy. So stay tuned for that. And please join us in April. We have a lot of exciting things for the spring conference.
Thanks so much, Ashley. Yes, we're really excited about that. And just a few other things that are in the works. Originally last spring, we intended to do some focus groups with students and adults who work with youth and young people. Again, kind of things got derailed a little bit, but we are back on track and we are hoping to get some of these focus groups done with some students of all age groups. So late elementary, middle school, high school, and even college students, as well as adults who work with youth and young people, because we really want to gain their perspective of the comic and thinking about things. How can it be used in a classroom setting? How can it be used with community-based organizations in collaboration with some of the work they're already doing? So this is just an example of some of our draft focus group guide questions that we put out there. But from that, we really want to develop facilitation guides. So thinking about some of the main themes that stand out to youth and young people and pulling out those concepts and saying, okay, so now we have this facilitation guide that teachers or any adult can use with the comic book in mind, where we don't have to be present to talk about the comic book. And so again, we're kind of leading into that implementation intervention phase. And then along with the revision of facilitation guides, we really hope to develop lesson plans. So one of the really cool things I think about this comic is is it, of course I'm in health promotion, health education, but it transcends across so many different topic areas, science, STEM, you can think about language arts, math, and, all of the sciences. And so I would love for us to think about ways to develop integrated lesson plans using this comic book. And so that would kind of be a phase 2 of this project as we're learning some feedback from students and teachers. And then we do plan to do a pilot with our current e-cigarette prevention program, hashtag I Can End the Trend. We are already in schools. Right now we're doing virtual programming with our own peer-to-peer approach, but we've talked about this and we would love this to be another umbrella as part of our program, kind of an offering with schools that we're already working with. So right now we're doing virtual programming, but we'd really like to kick this off when we're back in schools. And so this is probably going to be for the fall. And so if you work with schools, schools that might be interested, please let us know. We would like to figure out basically what's the impact of using this comic as kind of an addition to our current e-cigarette prevention program and or on its own. And so that's something that I'm really, really excited about, to gather some feedback on process evaluation, but also that impact evaluation to see, is it doing anything? Is it eliciting conversations? Is it inspiring them? And so not only am I interested in, kind of that pre to post, does it change their knowledge, their attitudes, their self-efficacy, but I think something like this can inspire our youth and young people to want to advocate for change. So how can we empower them to want to talk with legislators, elected officials, school board members, to change some of the policies or the landscape in their community? So I'm really, really excited for that next step. And so, of course, that means that we're in the process of building collaborations and figuring out what that dissemination looks like. As Ashley said, we had hoped last spring or kind of this fall to be in schools with the comic, and that just didn't happen. So the reality is that will probably be happening next fall. But if you are interested or you have ideas for collaboration, please feel free to reach out to me. I would love to discuss. And of course, we're looking at funding opportunities to see how we can, maybe build this on a larger scale. I know Bryan wants to do a version 2. So we kind of left the door open for some other opportunities there. And I would be more than willing to work on those projects as well. And again, just thank you to CCTS. And then of course, our sponsors that helped us print our first batch of comics, Breathe, College of Nursing, and College of Education. So I think we should have some time for questions.
Everyone, feel free to unmute yourselves and ask your question, or you can put it in the chat and we'll monitor it there.
Hi, good afternoon. This is James Aaron with CCTS. It's a great job on the comic. I've seen it. Well, I won't say I've seen the comic, but I've seen some final drafts, I think, and very impressive. I wondered, talking about how complex it was to manage the timeline and so forth, what's your thoughts on how much of that was just because this was the first time we had done this? Or is it really just kind of project by project? It's just going to be managing a lot of different things. I'm just wondering if people wanted to start doing this, something similar, do you think we have a good template for how to do it again?
That's a great question. Thank you, James. And team members, feel free to jump in. I would say, on the outside of this now, that it is project dependent, topic dependent. And as we mentioned, this was really a topic that was ever changing and is still changing in terms of policy and new developments. So I would say it depends upon the subject matter. But yes, there is a much better sense of, from my standpoint, of project managing, that I think that we could do this again and probably eliminate some of the things that took a little longer. But again, you always want to leave the room or the door open and some room for just figuring out the process as you go.
And I'll just say something real quick about as far as the template goes, and like from my past experience, and just leaving all that stuff out with this team and showing all the stuff. I think that we have a really great layout, and we'd be able to really carry this forward, because what we done with this first project and was able to complete it and replicate it, and I look forward to an issue 2 as well.
Just so everybody knows, Bryan clearly put on the cover issue 1. He's absolutely intending on moving forward with another one. So we'll see what happens.
I'd like to ask a question more as a parent than as a researcher. I read recently that TikTok videos have actually decreased music length, that they've gone down like precipitously. I think Old Country Road was only like 2 minutes, and in general that's influencing how much attention span people want to give to even music. And I guess part of my question is, are you thinking about animating this and making this something TikTok video like? I know as a parent of a teenager, that's where they're spending their time.
Yeah, and that's a really important point you bring up. You know, the communication means are changing among our youth and young people. I think that it's still helpful to have kind of this hard copy product to have, if we're in classrooms, especially, to have discussions and facilitate those discussions. But I also know that, you know, talking about one comic book one time is not enough to change this issue. And so having supplementary content, you know, might be, I know Bryan and I had talked at one point about having Instagram or having these characters come to life and kind of sharing their own messages. So I think there's a lot of potential. I also see there's a lot of alignment with our current e-cigarette prevention program, because we do use you know, a lot of social media to get those messages across. And so I would love to explore that idea of kind of bringing those characters to life and following their story. And maybe that's on social media. Although I will say, I'm not going to be the one creating the TikTok videos, because our young people are the ones that have to create those videos for them to actually watch them.
Oh, good. No, I love your product. It's really cool. I just kept thinking, would my kids sit down and with a comic in hand? I think if she were younger, maybe she would, but once they get to high school, I'd just be curious to see how the testing goes on that. So, and if there's any way I could help, I live in Danville. I know Danville, I'm on the board of the Danville schools where my husband is. So let me know if you want to come out to Danville and do some testing.
Thank you so much, Karen.
Yes, thank you, Karen. And I did want to add also that the communications director, Mallory Profeta, and I have had some conversations with our research communications office in the VPR's office, and we are going to be working on a video starting in April. I don't know exactly what it will be, you know, the topic, whether it's geared toward researchers and or kids and or both, but that is coming down the line. So we will have some multimedia and some videos to share that could potentially be posted to social media channels.